Hello and good evening. It's wonderful to be back here with you tonight. And I'd like to begin this evening's session with a quote from Marlene Dietrich, who said, "You're never lonely with a book." And I'd just like to raise a glass there to Marlene Dietrich, who knew a thing or two about life and reading. So welcome to tonight's session, which is a special evening about loneliness and how reading can help with loneliness. It's obviously a cliche to say that you're never alone with a book. And that, in a way, is what my whole bibliotherapy life is about. The joy of reading and the way that it can make you feel not alone. Hi, Helen, great to see you with us tonight. And hi, Sarah, lovely to see you too. I wonder if either of you have books which have been a source of comfort and solace when you felt lonely. If so, do send me a message. Hi, Ollie, great to see you too. Lovely to see lots of people joining this evening. And I'm going to come back later to some of your comments that people have made already on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook about books that have brought them comfort when they have felt loneliness or solitude. It's apparently we are experiencing an epidemic of loneliness at the moment. Research says that in the UK, 9 million people always or often feel lonely, and that young adults aged 16 to 24 reported feeling lonely more than those in older age groups, which is a very sad fact. And I'm going to be talking about ways in which reading can help combat loneliness and solitude. But before I come to that, I'd just like to focus for a minute on what could be seen as the joys of solitude, because loneliness isn't always a negative. Being on your own can actually be a wonderful thing to be celebrated. And there have been quite a few writers who have celebrated solitude, such as Virginia Woolf, who always said that she could never have written a single book if she didn't have a room of her own, and also weeks and months of solitude when she might have actually become depressed, but also did, as a result, write her books. Sylvia Plath in The Bell Jar also wrote a lot about solitude being both a positive and a negative thing. There's a fantastic book called Solitude by Anthony Storr, which was written in the 1980s, which is a hugely successful book in the world of psychology and self-help literature. It was a seminal book that challenged the psychological paradigm that heterosexual togetherness was the ultimate aim of all people. And he, on the contrary, celebrated the idea that being on your own could be equally rewarding and satisfying as being together with somebody else. He said, solitude ranks alongside relationships in its impact on an individual's well-being and productivity, as well as on society's progress and health. He cites numerous examples of brilliant scholars and artists, from Beethoven and Kant to Anne Sexton and Beatrix Potter, who, with their solitary activity, found that it was essential to their work, and they were, in a way, geniuses, perhaps because of their solitude. But I think you don't have to be in solitude to be a genius, and you don't have to be a genius to be solitary, if that makes any sense. That's a book that for 3 decades has given solace to many people about the comforts of solitude. And there are various other excellent non-fiction books that I'm going to be coming to later, which also very much celebrate solitude as a good thing. Now, we do have some novels which are also very much celebrating of being alone, one of which is a book that I have mentioned before on at least one of these sessions, which is Jean Giono's The Man Who Planted Trees, which is a very calming, beautiful, short book with woodcuts decorating it, which is all about a man who has come home from the war and spends all his time planting little acorn seeds, which then grow into oaks. And he spends all his time alone and loves his solitude. And that's a book which is very much a positive, persuasive force for the joys and benefits of solitude. The Bone People by Kerry Hume, which is a book from New Zealand written in the 1980s, winner of the Whitbread Prize in 1984, is a book which also celebrates solitude, though in a more complicated way, admittedly. So Jean Giono is a book, The Man Who Planted Trees, which is very much celebrating solitude. The Bone People, you see the ups and the downs, because the central character is called Carowyn Holmes. She's a painter who's lost her will to paint. She's isolated herself in a tower that she has built herself on the edge of a beach in southern New Zealand. One evening, she finds a young mute boy living in her home. Now, this is a really fascinating novel because it's about solitude, but it's also about the ways that solitude can bring creativity, which does happen for her, but also the way in which solitude can be destructive. So we see both sides of the coin in that novel, but it's a really great novel, which I would very much recommend. So there's many other books that I want to mention, which are particularly great for turning to when you are feeling the sadness of solitude. And I also want to talk to you about the ways in which reading can bring you comfort. And I think I'm going to intersperse the books with the possible activities that you can do. So one of the lovely things that you can do to help with solitude is to create for yourself a lovely reading nook. And you can see behind me, I have that reading nook, which is quite often occupied by a cat. And if you are someone feeling alone, if you have a lovely reading nook a bit like that, or it can just be the corner of a sofa or a cushion halfway up the stairs, or maybe an outdoor reading nook like a treehouse, which is a really lovely thing, then you should go and sit in that reading nook. I will just demonstrate with a good book whenever you can. Make yourself extremely comfortable. Maybe even have some blankets around you to get even more cozy and calm and peaceful. And the point of doing that is that whenever you go and sit in that reading nook, it's a signal to your body and brain that now you are going to read. And you'll get all sorts of cozy pheromones coming in because you're sitting in such a cozy place and you've got your book to hand. Maybe even if you can, you should have a shelf or a little table next to your reading nook where you can keep a cup of tea or a glass of wine. And that will very much help you to combat feelings of solitude, apart from, of course, the fact that you're going to be reading a book and the book is your friend. Great to see you, Estelle and David. Thanks for coming. And I'd love to hear from you too, if you've got any particular books that you turn to when you are feeling lonely or in solitude. And hi to all the people joining me on Instagram too. If you have any thoughts on books which are your comfort reads, I'd love to know about them. Other books that celebrate solitude before we get on to books to turn to for combating loneliness are, for instance, Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, which very much celebrates this fiercely independent woman, Janie Crawford, who is the heroine of the book, who actually, in the end, fights for the right to be single and enjoy her solitude. And it's a really fantastic read, which is completely gripping, all about the Black American female experience. Incredibly inspiring. Another one, which is non-fiction celebrating solitude, is A Field Guide to Getting Lost by Rebecca Solnit, which is a very thoughtful, philosophical, rambling book which celebrates, in a way, rambling through the countryside on your own and why that can be a wonderful and helpful thing to do. It's on the same lines in some ways as Wild by Cheryl Strayed, which is a book that many people have drawn a lot of comfort, solace, and strength from. It's a memoir about how at 26 Cheryl Strayed thought she'd lost everything. In the wake of her mother's rapid death from cancer, her family disbanded and her marriage crumbled. With nothing to lose, she made the most impulsive decision of her life to walk 1,100 miles of the west coast of America, from the Mojave Desert through California and Oregon and into Washington state, and to do it alone, which is pretty amazing. She experienced long distance hiking, not having enough money, and really having to deal with her own solitude and confronting her own self and thinking about what she really wanted from life. But it is a book that has given much strength to many people, and I would say it's definitely one to read and put onto your list. Um, there was a book recently published in 2018 called A Biography of Loneliness by Faye Bound Alberti, which seeks to describe and explore what loneliness is. She says, the problem is that loneliness is seldom defined. It's often presented as an individual, even universal, mental affliction. But loneliness is relatively new. The word comes into common usage around 1800, linked to social change, especially the secularity, alienation, and competition produced by modernity. Before then, it was solitude that interested writers and philosophers. Solitude could be problematic, but in a landscape forged by God, was one ever alone? Loneliness is different at different times, yet it can be desperate and crushing and agonizing. But it can also be temporary, transitory, a pinch point or life stage. Loneliness is not a single emotion, but a mix of different feelings, including anger, resentment, and fear, as well as sorrow, grief, and shame. It can even be pleasurable. She says, as a historian of emotion, these complexities and the absence of any existing extended historical inquiry inspired this new book, A Biography of Loneliness. She has case studies including Virginia Woolf, Sylvia Plath, Queen Victoria, and many more, and it explores loneliness as a modern psychological affliction. So it is interesting to ponder the idea that loneliness is something that we've experienced far more in the last 200 to 300 years, rather than pre-18th century, when people tended to live together far more on top of each other. That obviously did have its own issues, but loneliness was probably not one of them. So frequently, people verily would have sought out solitude far more, whereas now we have the opposite problem. So loneliness is something very much in our present. Also, naturally, because of the pandemic, many people have experienced far more extreme loneliness than ever before because of having to be confined to their own homes and not see their friends and family. So, coming back to ways that reading can help to combat this scourge of loneliness, we've talked about creating a reading nook. I would now like to sing the praises to the joys of rereading books. Many people who I have spoken to have talked about how much they love going back to childhood reads. And in my case, I can completely agree with that idea, and I very often go back to the Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, which is one of my favourite books of all time, and it's a book that I read in childhood, have also read to my own children, and love to listen to on audiobook, love to read, because it takes me straight back to being a child myself. It takes me to an incredibly cozy world. I think it's obviously to do with having read it as a child, but it's also to do with the place itself, the fact that it's written about an era pre telephones, pre any of the modern appliances that we have, a world where everything seemed much simpler. And it's just about really three characters, the main girl, the heroine, Mary Lennox, and then the boy who's the hypochondriac who's stuck in bed, Colin, and then there's Dickon, the force of nature. And there are obviously a few other characters, but it's a very tiny, cozy world. And that's a book I love to go back to. But I'm sure that all of you will find that when you walk around your house and see your old books, many of those books you'll look at and feel like that's an old friend of yours. And even just that activity of walking around and looking at your books is a way of talking to those old friends, your books. So, for instance, when I walked around my shelves earlier today, I picked up Captain Corelli's Mandolin by Louis de Bernières, which is a really fantastic read. If you haven't read it, you must. It's very romantic. It's set on a Greek island. It does have tragedy and sadness within it, but it's a book that completely sweeps you away and takes you out of your own preoccupations and makes you feel not lonely because you dive into that book and become as one with it. And that is one of the ways that books can enrich and help you when you're feeling lonely. They provide you with friends in the form of the fictional characters. Another one, which is on those lines, is Louis de Bernières's Birds Without Wings, one of his more recent novels. And it's really interesting. It's another fantastic novel set against the backdrop of the collapsing Ottoman Empire, with the Gallipoli campaign and the subsequent bitter struggle between Greeks and Turks. That sets the backdrop to this, but it's very much a human story, as is Captain Corelli. And one of the things I love about Louis de Bernières is that lots of his characters come into the different books which he writes so that they meet up in other fictional moments of his later novels. And that makes reading his books like an endless saga in which you can watch his characters carrying on with their lives so that they feel completely real to you. Another writer that I love in that same way, who has the same effect, is Patrick Gale, who writes many wonderful novels, frequently set in Cornwall, but actually this one, A Place Called Winter, is set in Canada, and it takes you back to the early 20th century when Harry Kane, an English gentleman, goes for mysterious reasons, which you will discover when you read it, to live in Canada and to start his own farm in the middle of nowhere. And this is a book which you get completely caught up in and totally believe in the characters, they become your friends. But also his modern novels, which are far more frequent. I think this is only his only historical novel so far, are all set in Cornwall, and they have characters who also interrelate, like Louis de Bernière, and move from one book to the next. And they too become your friends. It's one of the defining characteristics of Patrick Gale's work that you feel as if not only he, but his characters have become your friends, and you might well bump into them in the street. So those are both books that I picked up and thought, yes, they're old friends of mine, and I just want to dive into those books again. But even if you don't pick it up and reread it, just knowing that that book is there, glimpsing it for a moment on your shelf, is like bumping into an old friend. So that is very much one of the ways that books can help with solitude, simply by existing in your house. So I hope you're not all people who have thrown away all your books and kept them solely on Kindle or ebook form, because I do think it is a lovely thing to have some tangible books, even if you only keep a select few, which you might want to keep on your favourites shelf, which is another practical exercise that I talk about in my book, The Art of Mindful Reading, which is a book full of helpful tips on how to get more out of your reading. And many of the ideas that I'm talking about tonight, which are about practical ways of getting more out of your books, sharing them, and so on, are written about in this very book. So we're talking about rereading, and one of the people that responded to me on Twitter thinking about ideas of books that have helped them through loneliness wrote that she frequently rereads Jane Eyre because that's a book which she read in her childhood, which she sadly said was one of the loneliest moments of her life. But she obviously takes comfort in returning to that book and responds to Jane Eyre's solitary life because she was a deeply lonely person in her childhood. So this reader finds solace and comfort in going back to reread Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is a book that I do often find people love to reread, partly perhaps because they read it perhaps when they were a teenager, and it's great to go back to books you read as a teenager because you revisit your younger self, but also because Jane Eyre did experience such great sadness and solitude, but had the fortitude to continue and win through. Are there any of you out there who also love Jane Eyre, I wonder? Other rereads that I'd like to mention are rereads from your own early childhood. And I've got a couple which I just want to share with you now. One of my favourite books that I love to go back to is Orlando, the Marmalade Cat by Kathleen Hale, Kathleen Hale, which is an amazing, beautiful, gorgeous book. I think I have seen smaller versions of it, but I think it's quite difficult to get them smaller than this. And as you'll see, the illustrations are absolutely gorgeous. They're quite old-fashioned. You can see that they're written about a time when horses and carts went on the streets and cats seemed to get away with murder. They're really lovely. They're great books to share with children. But I must admit, I do read these completely selfishly for my own reasons, even though I did also read them to my children. So going back to books from your own childhood is a great idea because that will take you back to when you were very small. And one of the books I also love to look back on is a Dr. Seuss book, which is Dr. Seuss's sleep book. And it's full of, again, absolutely fabulous drawings and illustrations. It's very funny, like all the Doctor Seuss's, and it is full of wonderful images of all the creatures going to sleep around you. I think this is one of the most comforting books because it has all these lovely images of people going to sleep together in a huge mass or huddle, which is clearly the very opposite of solitude. And the actual writing is very funny, but so are the illustrations. I'll just show you the inscription on here. It says Isabella Berti, Pretoria, 1970. Sorry, April 1970. So I was 2 years old when I got this book. It's very, very old, and it's a wonderful treasure. This is a book that if I'm feeling lonely, I go and look at because it makes me feel really cozy, warm, and loved, taking me back to when I lived in South Africa, age 2, and my parents brought me that book. Um, Talking of childhood books as well, another one that I love to go back to is one that we read to our children. And people out there who have children, you will probably feel incredibly nostalgic about the time when they were really little and you used to read them books all the time. This one was one of our complete favourites. It's called A Pipkin of Pepper by Helen Cooper, and it has incredible, very detailed, gorgeous illustrations. Just trying to show you some of those. And it's all about 3 characters who are looking for a pipkin of pepper for the pumpkin soup. It's really gorgeous, very funny, very warm and cozy, partly because of being about soup, which is very nourishing to the soul, but it has a wonderful warmth about it. It's also about one of the characters getting lost, and it has lots of warm and friendly ideas about how to prevent your children or yourself getting lost. So, this is a wonderful antidote to loneliness in many ways. And as a adjunct to the fact that this individual book is brilliant, I just like to suggest that idea of going back to books, if you've kept them, that you've read to your own children or which you were read by your parents when you were a child, because both of those will be wonderful ways of combating loneliness. Of course, if your children have fled the nest, then you might simply be sobbing into the book and wishing that they were still tiny. But on the positive and bright side, I think you will find that rereading these lovely books to yourself will bring back all sorts of warm, friendly, cozy pheromones about how lovely that period was in your life. Another book that I must mention as a fantastic book that helps to evade loneliness is The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, which is famous around the world for its gorgeous illustrations and its wonderful actual story. It's a very surreal read, and it is one of those books that you can read just as deeply as an adult as you can as a child. And actually, I think it's a book that you probably enjoy more as an adult, maybe, than you do as a child. But the illustrations themselves are absolutely gorgeous, as you can see here. There's the little prince all on his own on his planet. But the reason why it's a great book for helping to combat solitude and loneliness is because the little prince does live all on his own on a planet with nothing for company but his imagination, and it completely celebrates the imagination and the power of imagination to overcome loneliness. There he is in all his glory. And Antoine de Saint-Exupéry did write several other fantastic both novels and non-fiction about travel and adventure, which are really brilliant. So he's a great one to read. I might come back to children's books, but I'd also like to now talk about other ways that books can help you to avoid feelings of loneliness, such as reading aloud with a friend or a partner, which is something you may feel that's a contradictory idea if you're on your own. So there's a few different ways of reading aloud. One is you can read aloud over video phones, video chat, Zoom, or FaceTime, etc. It's actually been taking off during the pandemic. Many of my bibliotherapy clients have embraced the idea of reading aloud with a long distant relative, partner, friend, parent, and have actually found it to be a really wonderful way of communicating with each other, because reading aloud, if you are in the same room, is of course a wonderful thing to do, and I highly recommend to anyone that can, whether it's reading aloud with your partner, reading aloud with a child, reading aloud with a friend who you live with, reading aloud with anyone that you can get hold of in your vicinity, but also reading aloud long distance is equally fabulous and very much to be embraced if possible. The reading agency have been putting together many reports about the benefits of reading aloud, and they have created a new initiative called Reading Friends, which is funded by the Lottery Fund, where they arrange for reading buddies to go and visit people, whether it's in hospices or hospitals or with isolated elderly people. They match up a reading buddy with a person, and they find ways that that reading buddy can go and visit the elderly person or the person in a hospice, etc., once a week and read to them, which is a really lovely and fabulous idea. The reading group also shares reading in groups. Obviously, at the moment with the pandemic, that hasn't been happening, and it's just beginning to come back together now. But I would really recommend, if you know anyone who is isolated, living on their own, perhaps elderly or in a hospice, then you can apply to the reading agency's Reading Friends to find a reading buddy. I will put details of that up on my Facebook page later. The reading agency discovered that 88% of participants in this scheme appreciated the increased social contact from reading inspired conversations. So that's putting it into, they obviously had to do a kind of technical scientific breakdown, but they've also shown that reading groups can provide a route out of social isolation for young mothers who are particularly susceptible to loneliness, with many saying that it helps them to find ways of talking to each other, which is not a surprise. And that's actually something that I'm frequently talking to bibliotherapy clients about as well, that reading to a partner or a friend or a distant relative can be a great way to start a conversation, because all of us end up at times not having so much to talk about, particularly during the pandemic. And if you do have something to read to each other and share, that gives you a starting point for a conversation. So that's why I quite often recommend the book Some by David Eagleman, which is full of short stories all about ideas about the afterlife, but really it's about ideas about life as we know it. And they are really thought provoking and a great way to start a conversation. So, reading aloud is a fantastic idea to try with anyone. If you are completely isolated and don't have anyone willing to be read to, reading to may sound absurd, but reading to a cat or reading to a dog or even reading to a cuddly toy can also be a fantastic release. It may at first seem a bizarre and weird thing to do, but if you try it, then whether if it is a cat or a dog that you're reading to, you will find that they are a fantastic listener and that they will, I'm sure, love that experience. And in schools at the moment in the UK, quite a lot of people are using reading dogs as a method of getting children who have learning difficulties to read more, because they have found that if you can uh, ask a child to read to a dog who comes into the school, that child will actually love that idea. I've just seen that Michael Uliot has joined, I think, from Canada, which is great to see you here tonight. Thanks for joining us. And it's lovely to see lots of people here on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to know if you have any stories to share of books that you have read when you have been feeling lonely and which have helped you out of that. So I'm now just talking about different methods of sharing reading which will help to combat loneliness, one of which is reading aloud, which is a fantastic idea and very much to be encouraged. Another is to have a reading group. So again, you might say, how do I have a reading group when I'm in a pandemic? Well, a lot of people have created new reading groups online. So there are many on Facebook. There's also quite a few reading groups which were already established who've now gone on to Zoom, which also does work, but it's clearly difficult if you have more than 5 or 6 people to keep the conversation going. I think at the moment, if you are still unable to meet up with people physically, then a great way to have a reading group is to just have it as a reading group between 2 people. So to arrange with a friend that you will both read the same book at the same time and then make a date for when you're going to meet in a month's time, which can be virtually, very likely will be virtually. Um, and then you can have a conversation over a screen about the book. Or if you are able to, you might be able to go for a walk together and talk about the book. And this is a great way to actually make sure that you do read a book, which will in itself stop you from feeling lonely because of the fact that you'll be into that book and feeling that the characters within the book are your friends. And also, it will give you a reason to get together in a month's time and have a conversation all about the book. So that's all about how to have a reading group at this current time. Another brilliant idea, which I do describe in my book, The Art of Mindful Reading, is to create a library at the end of your garden. Now, I know that quite a lot of you might already have done this. It's a really wonderful movement that's been taking off around the world, which began 5 years ago in Wisconsin with a man called Todd Ball, who created the first little free library. Have any of you done that already, I wonder? Um, This was in tribute to his mother, a teacher who loved reading. He made a small wooden house just large enough for 20 books and put it on a post at the end of his drive. Above it, he wrote, "Free books." Before long, his idea, someone's saying, is he related to Ollie Ball? I don't know. As his idea became a book sharing movement across the US, and now little libraries appear all over the world, which are popping up in East London, in Australia. I've seen pictures of them all over the place. And you can go onto Facebook or onto the Little Free Library website and find many pictures of all the fabulous little free libraries that are around the world. Charlie is saying that you have already created a little free library. Is that right? That's really exciting. And well done. I wonder if you can send in a photo. That would be so cool. Try and do that if you can. So if you can, create a little free library at the end of your drive or at the end of your garden. It will make you feel more connected with your community, because you will put, thanks Charlie, you're going to try and send me a photo, that's great. You will put books that you don't need or that you want to share with the world into that little free library, and then your friends and neighbours will come and borrow a book. They might take it away forever, they might give it back eventually, and they will also maybe put in a book instead. And that is a really lovely thing to do. Ollie from Israel is saying that we have this all over Israel too, which is excellent news. That's so good. And I think anyone that can should definitely do it. There's a few tips from Todd Ball. He says you should have at least one shelf in your little box if you can. A post that won't tip over, cement it in if you can as well. You can find tips for how to build it on the Little Free Library website, or you could adapt a bird table or rabbit hutch for the purpose. Ideally, you want an attractively designed box that will fit around 25 books in it, and then you've got to waterproof it like crazy so that the rain doesn't get in, particularly if you live in England. It's great to put it not too close to your front door so that you don't have people knocking on your door when you don't want them to, but close enough that you can ideally watch what's going on from your windows and see when people turn up to take a book. You should also put in a little library lending book in there so that people can write comments. And generally speaking, people have treated these little free libraries with great respect, positivity, and joy. Of course, every now and then people might abuse the system. One just has to be prepared for that. But mostly people are really lovely and positive about it, and often leave new exciting books in there too. So it's a great thing to do. You should also make a sign saying that these books are available for free so that people realize that it's not that they're not stealing from you. And then you can also join the community of little free libraries and have all the more fun with the whole thing. So that's one of the ways that you can share books, which I describe in my book, The Art of Mindful Reading. And we've talked about reading aloud. We've talked about having your own mini reading group with one other person, perhaps, until we go back to living in a normal way, hopefully, when we can actually have reading groups that get together and have a glass of wine together. And I just want to talk, if we'll see if we have time for more books, but one other tip that I'd like to share with you for combating feelings of loneliness while reading, I'm just going to demonstrate. So in order to show you this particular exercise, I just need to move my chair out of the way. and I hope that I'm going to have enough room and not knock anything over. Something that I love to do as a way of combating loneliness is to read while hula hooping. And I have demonstrated this before to some of you. I'm just going to see if I've got enough room. I'm going to have to slightly adjust my laptop so that it's a slightly better view, hopefully. And I'm also just adjusting the Instagram. Oops, sorry about that, everyone. Having a little bit of technical issues here with my different screens. So hopefully the key is, have I got enough room to show you? But hula hooping while reading is a great way to stop yourself from feeling lonely. Here we go. Oops, have I got enough room? Just about. So I tend to normally do this downstairs in my sitting room because I've got a lot more space down there. But yay, it's working up here as well. I have recently brought in a few extra bits of furniture here, which is why I don't have quite so much room. But you might ask, why is this a good thing to do? How does it stop you from feeling lonely? Well, you are reading while exercising. There's a certain amount of comedy in the activity, which also makes it all the more enjoyable and will probably bring a smile to your face. I will just demonstrate for a minute reading aloud while hula hooping, but really what you want to do is just read quietly to yourself. So I just want to share another exercise about sharing books while I'm hula hooping, just to prove to you that I can do it. Release books into the wild. A lovely way to share books is by releasing a favourite loved book into the world, then following where it goes. A movement called book crossing began in the US in 2001. I wonder if any of you US listeners know about this. I bet you do. It's since grown worldwide, with books travelling to Amsterdam, Australia, India, and many more places. 7 million books have travelled to more than 130 countries since the movement began. The way the system works is that you go to the book crossing website and sign up. You then print out a label to put on your book, and you can follow its progress via the website. Whoever discovers the book will find instructions on the label about how to log the book. Using this method, books have crossed continents and sparked thousands of bookish conversation. A similar scheme was started in the UK called Book Swap, in which the Guardian newspaper encouraged readers to take a photo of a book they were leaving in a random spot in a city, upload it to their website, then wait for it to be found. A sticker inside instructed readers, where have I got to, what to do. This movement gathered momentum when a large TV company got behind it and tracked the books. If you start your own book crossing habit, you will be rewarded by many happy readers discovering your favourite book, and will in turn discover many of your own new reads. So there we go. Hula hooping and reading at the same time is a great way to combat loneliness. It's also a good way to keep fit, because particularly with a weighted hula hoop, which is what I was using just there, it does give you a pretty good workout. So thank you for your positive comments. I'm glad you enjoyed the hula hooping while reading, which I feel is a great way to stop feeling lonely, because you will definitely make yourself laugh if you hula hoop and read. Before we stop, I'm just going to mention a couple of books that you readers mentioned as books that you have loved during times of loneliness. And one of those is Ollie shared that she is immersed in the Outlander book series. Thanks, Ollie, for sharing that with us. And she says that she's reading her fourth now and is completely in love with the characters. And actually, I've heard a lot of people who love the Outlander novels. They are fantastically immersive and take you to another time, another place, another world where everything seems much simpler than it is now, even though there's obviously huge dramas going on. And for the characters, it's not simpler. But for us, readers and watchers, it's a great way to escape from our own preoccupations. And Colleen is agreeing that you love Outlander too. I think you might have mentioned it before on another session that you loved it, Colleen, which is great. And it clearly is a series which inspires much passion and love in people. Actually, I wanted to mention series as another great way of escaping solitude. If you can dive into a series of books, that's why people quite often love to read a big fat tome of a book rather than a tiny little slim book, because series are great because you read one, devour it, and then you know that there's another 10 to come. And a couple of series which I love, I know lots of you have seen me talking about these before, are the Moomin books, which in a way they're not really a series because they don't follow on from each other, but they're all related and they're all wonderful, gorgeous stories. And actually, one of my listeners tonight also mentioned that Moominland Midwinter is one of the books that she has turned to in times of sadness and solitariness and loneliness, because the Moominland in Midwinter is actually a book very much about solitude and sadness, and it is a really gorgeous book which I would completely recommend. And another series which I have also loved returning to is the Ursula Le Guin Wizard of Earthsea trilogy. I love them partly because I had them as a child and because they're magical, they're kind of coming of age books. So they're one of the ones that it's great to rediscover on my shelf and see as an old friend. But they're also a great, brilliant, profound series of novels, which are in some ways like a grown up Harry Potter collection. So they were both mentioned uh, earlier, and also other books that people have mentioned that they've loved are Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead and other books by Ayn Rand, and also, of course, Armistead Maupin's Tales of the City, which is a wonderful series of books. I think there's 10 of them in all, and they are really fantastically immersive books, all about the gay scene in San Francisco, but there's so much going on with them. There's lots of stories which were relevant to the times that they were written. They have aspects of AIDS. There's lots of political events going on, and they're just great to escape into at the time they were, and also equally they are now, because now it's nice to go back to those times, but all the characters are really fantastic and they feel like your friends in the same way that Patrick Gale's characters feel like your friends. Another book which I have recently read and completely loved and found to be an excellent read for combating loneliness is a book called, now I'm actually going completely blank, having had it in my mind a second ago. Oh, it's The Christadora, which is a novel set in New York in the Christadora building, which is a real building, which was built as kind of social housing, where it was meant to be for people with very low incomes to go and live. But inevitably it became yuppified and done up, and in the end lots of very rich people went and lived in it. And the Christadora is about various characters who live in that building, and two of them are artists who are very rich and privileged, with their son who unfortunately falls into a bad crowd and becomes a drug addict. And one of their neighbours is someone from a far lower income situation and who is a drug user and dealer. And it's an utterly gripping, fantastic novel which takes place over 30 years. And it's one of those books that you read and think, I want that to go on forever, and I can't quite cope with the fact that it's ended. Which brings me to one last comment that I just want to make, in terms of another exercise for avoiding feelings of loneliness and solitude. Keep a reading notebook. So regular listeners will know that I've talked about this before, and it's something that I very frequently come back to. Choose a lovely book that you like as an object and which feels good. Then whenever you finish reading a book, during the moment of mourning the loss of the book and wishing that you were still reading it, pick up your reading notebook, write in, just devote one page to the book that you've just read, and write the title of the book, author, date you finished reading it, place you were when you read it, which at the moment is going to be pretty much at home, but hopefully soon we'll be traveling again, and you might read it on a beach, on a plane, on a train, visiting relatives. And then write a few notes about the book. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Did you like the narrator? Did you wish that person hadn't died at the end? Were there any particular resonances with your life, with characters from the book? And it's a great way just to keep your memories of the book you've just read. So it's a way of holding on to your feelings and responses to the book. Don't feel like you're writing it for anyone else, or that it's any kind of academic exploration. It's just for you as an aide memoir. So, on that note, I will end for tonight. Thanks so much for joining me this evening. I will put a list of all the books that I've mentioned on my Facebook page and on Instagram. And I will see you again next week. Thanks for coming. And Tammy, thanks for mentioning that you used to do this as a child but haven't since. It was over 35 years ago. It's never too late to start again. Do it again now, because you will definitely love doing that. You won't regret it. And it's a really great thing to do. It's also very inspiring for your own children to see that you do it, because it makes them realize that books are important. They're not just frivolous, that you actually want to hold on to your memories about them. So thanks so much for coming. I will see you next week, I hope. Good night.